Excuse me, Chair, can you hear me? Excuse me, Chair, we can't hear anything at all. There's a mute on your Overview and Scrutiny Committee mic.
Can you hear now, Councillor Manro?
Yes, apologies. I was trying to let people know. So we haven't heard anything at all.
Shall I summarise, Chair?
If you could,
I'll summarise.
Don't worry about
briefly.
time. We'll give you the extra time.
I'll summarise very briefly.
Yes, I think also I think if Councillor Hirsch also, if you can repeat your question, so Councillor Manro can answer.
You want to go first? Yeah.
We'll kind of be brief about it. I think I mentioned all of our interest is that we really have a leisure centre and we'll give this project the best possible opportunity to pass this time round. It is a complex project which is still risky with building on open land, and there are still a lot of questions around how much affordable housing it will provide. Have we really considered to build a leisure centre which allows the smallest amount of, or needs the smallest amount of housing required? Is it really kind of necessary to build on open land at all? Have we considered the effects on flora and fauna? And is the housing the smallest and the most affordable in order to allow us to have the leisure centre reinstated? And also to understand how likely it is that the leisure centre will open first and gets priority before the housing.
Thank you, Councillor Hirsch. Councillor Gallant, if you want to repeat your question, so
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'll be very quick. It's as a mirror, Councillor Hirsch, we want to see a successful outcome here. We don't want to see a failed application. The sounding board is not a cabinet, is not a whipped cabinet. It is a sounding board of of various opinions. We're very grateful to Sir Sherard for chairing it, but we feel that the members have things to say, and we'd like that heard at the earliest possible opportunity. Central line of argument is the question about building on metropolitan open land, where there are no very special circumstances to do so. Second question for me is, this is a major West London destination where people coming from inside the borough, outside the borough, has sufficient thought been put into whether there's enough parking, whether there's enough vehicle access to substantiate that major Olympic-sized swimming pool, that major facility. And although there is detail in the feasibility study, and although the question has been sort of answered before, I feel it should be discussed more at this early stage. And my third question is about income and mitigation. Has enough creative thinking been put into various lines of income? I'm going to put up what you may consider to be a strange idea, is that if a data center was built next to the sports center, there could be an extraordinarily useful heat exchange between the two facilities. But that is an example of creative thinking about how this project could be funded apart from building houses and borrowing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Gallant. If you can switch but don't touch the microphones will trigger again. Great. So now we've got a speaker, Chris Sinnott from Save Glenelg. Chris, you've got 3 minutes, and hopefully your mic will work.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's working. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. We are representing the views of 7 groups from the sounding board. These are as follows: the Grinnell Grove Residents Association, Pittshanger Community Association, Drayton's Community Association, Ealing Matters, Brent River and Canal Society, Save Grinnell, and Stop the Towers. These groups represent the wider Ealing community view and are only They're the only groups taking broader planning policy requirements into account. We're requesting that the committee refer the decision made on Grinnell back to cabinet for reconsideration. Our reasons are as follows. Reason one, the sounding board process was not followed as Councillor Monroe described it in his presentation. The cabinet were misled. The last sounding board meeting was held on the 28th of September. We were not consulted on the proposals presented to cabinet. We saw these along with the public when cabinet papers were published. We were only offered a Q&A session 2 days ahead of cabinet meeting. Sir Sherrard counted this as a sounding board meeting, but it really wasn't. Sir Sherrard also stated that the community group's report was from Save Grinnell, which is also not really true. It came from 7-member groups. And the importance of the report and the concerns regarding MOL were diminished and not discussed at cabinet. The second reason, the recommendation to demolish Grinnell as soon as possible was not discussed. Without an approved plan, we should not demolish Grinnell. There is a major risk that the plans are refused again, either by the mayor or called in by the Secretary of State. If that happens, our fallback position should be to retrofit our leisure center. If it's demolished, we lose that option. Third reason, the sounding board's position on enabling development was not discussed at the cabinet. The majority of sounding board members opposed the option of funding from enabling development on MOL, as this would repeat the failings of the previous scheme. Additionally, Ealing's public survey on Grinnell found only 33% of the 1,900 respondents had selected mixed-use development as a preferred funding option. That's actually a minority. We want the cabinet to listen to the majority. We still believe the plans for the new leisure center are over-egged. People want a replacement for Grinnell so their children can learn to swim and they can exercise. If funds are tight, we need to cut our cloth to address the greatest need, which would still serve the needs of the swimming club. If Grinnell is to have a broader regional purpose, then regional funds need to be found to pay for it. Finally, reason 4, the GLA have not been consulted on the plans. This project meets the criteria of strategic importance and would require the council to formally consult with the mayor. Those discussions have not yet happened according to our FOIs. Finally, we ask the committee to respond to the following questions. If you decide to uphold the cabinet decision tonight, how do you justify it knowing that the sounding board consultation was not followed as intended? And the second question is, there is a significant risk that the revised proposal does not receive planning permission. If this materializes, what is the contingency plan to ensure we don't end up with another Ealing cinema situation? Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you for your contributions. Now we'll go over to Sir Capel Coles, who's online as well. He's got 3 minutes as well.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. And thank you for the contribution from the groups. Of course, I don't agree with the characterization of the sounding board process. But as I've said before, this is a very, very difficult decision. Councillor Hirsch, Councillor Garton, they've all put their finger on it. It's a question of striking very difficult balances between the need for a really impressive development that Ealing and West London could be proud of, the need to finance it, the need to find space for it, and there are no easy answers. And the sounding board process, I think there's a misunderstanding, perhaps deliberate, on the part of some members of the sounding board that the sounding board has some sort of sovereignty over this. The decisions are for the councillors, our democratically elected representatives, to make these difficult choices. Governing, as I said at the first meeting of the sounding board, is about choosing. The sounding board has, I think, pretty successfully aired many of the concerns about the use of metropolitan open land, about the housing development, about access for vehicles, about the actual siting of the centre itself. We rejected effectively the idea of retrofitting the existing building. So I think the sounding board has played an important part in ventilating the concerns of sections of the community, but now it is for the council to take these tough decisions in the interests of the people of Ealing and indeed of West London. and that means making choices that will not necessarily please all of the people all of the time, but that's government. And in the end, I think the work that's been done by the planning consultants and others points to something of which this borough and indeed this great city can and should be very proud of. But it's no good pretending that you'll please all of the people all of the time, because you won't. But that's why we elected you as our councillors, to make these tough choices.
Great. Thank you very much for your contribution. So next stage is then a response from Councillor Manro, the portfolio holder, who has 3 minutes. Councillor Manro.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Apologies, I'm having to do this through Zoom. I'm away out of the country at the moment, but Councillor Donnelly's there just in case we have a technical problem. First of all, I'm not going to go through all the reasons for calling, as we've published a document, a supplementary document, which goes through all those questions and answers them in detail. I hope people have received that and have got access to that. Have they? I'm just wondering whether anybody's received it. Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to make a short statement, Chair, and then we can have questions, etc. Look, the council has been working extremely hard to make progress on this important project. We are committed to delivering on our pledge to deliver a state-of-the-art leisure facilities in the borough and to re-providing the Gurnell Leisure Centre. And the centre has a pivotal role to play in that. As I outlined previously, a cabinet and the council has made a current leisure centre is completely unsafe and unsustainable building. Even a full refurbishment of the building would fail to deliver the high quality leisure facilities that residents deserve. Leisure centres up and down the country are closing due to issues of energy inefficiency. So we want to deliver a centre that is sustainable in the long term, financially and environmentally. The Gurnell Sounding Board has played a central role in informing the design of this project and in representing the views of residents and local stakeholder groups. This engagement has helped us to reach the consensus that the current centre is not fit for purpose and the leisure centre should be replaced as soon as possible. Funding projects like this in a resource-constrained environment is always a challenge. We have listened to residents and are striving to produce a scheme that will help us deliver these high-quality facilities whilst also avoiding further rises in council tax or irresponsible council borrowing. We have learned important lessons from the Eco-Wall scheme and don't intend to repeat their mistakes. In taking control of this scheme, we have been very clear that any enabling development will be just that, focused on enabling delivery of the leisure centre rather than chasing maximized density and profit. The new proposals for enabling residential development have been scaled back in terms of building heights compared to the Eco-Wall scheme. Crucially, it should be noted that the enabling development will not cover the full cost of the scheme, and we will also need to invest in order to fully fund the project. The entire process has been underpinned by our values of openness, transparency, and inclusivity. And I look forward to continuing our work with residents, stakeholders, and officers to re-provide Gurnell to deliver a leisure centre that residents of all ages and abilities can be used and be proud of. And now I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. I'm aware that there is a document, a briefing as a response to the questions raised by the caller-ins, but it hasn't been circulated to the committee members or to Councillors Gallant or Hirsch. So members may well be asking questions which are covered in that document, but nobody's seen the responses. So you may have quite a few questions, and if members of the committee want to ask questions, then we can ask whatever you wish. So we'll go over to questions. So Councillor Rice, Councillor Summers, go first.
Thank you, Chair, and sorry about the microphone there. Talking about the financial side, looking at one of the questions there, can I just ask about what contingency is in place considering the fact that we have got a situation where we've got high inflation, which has actually affected some projects. What are we doing to actually take that into account? How are we going to manage the situation that we're in a very kind of volatile, unpredictable time at the moment? And also, I think questions about parking are quite fair. It does say in the report that we've been reading through here for this meeting that one assumption is that you'll have shared parking for residents and for users of the centre. That what would happen is the residents would be away from home during the day, and then users of the centre would come and use those parking spaces during the day. Do we actually believe that? Because really, I would have thought it would also be very much expected that residents, when they come home in the evening, they'll use their parking spaces, but then there'll be residents from other parts of the borough or other parts of London or elsewhere will then want to drive in and use the centre during the evening. And so actually that kind of sharing of parking spaces isn't really particularly feasible, really. I think, are we actually going to take that into account when it comes down to any kind of planning application? This is difficult because we don't actually have a planning application to have a look through, but I mean, is that something that we actually going to have a proper look at the parking and make this work? Because otherwise, I don't think people are going to really come on board with it unless we make something that's realistic and it's not going to actually frighten residents in the area who don't want people parking in their streets. Thank you.
Ro, do you want to respond?
Yeah, sorry, do you want me to respond, Chair?
Yes, Councillor Munro.
Yeah, okay. So I think people are misunderstanding what process is taking place and where we are in the stage of this complex project. We're at a very early stage. The only real decision that's been taken is around demolition of the existing leisure centre. We will then go through a formal process of moving towards a planning application where people will have another chance to make comments about all the issues that are being raised. So I think we're sort of running before we get to that stage. We will have a process in place. There are, in the reports, it's indicated there would be 175 places provided for the leisure centre. And I can't see anywhere where it says it's going to be shared. This will be a planning process. So really, I think the committee should be aware that we will have the feasibility studies will take place. There'll be a whole process put in place. We will be consulting with the sounding board, and then the planning application will go in. Then the GLA will be involved in that process, and then it will come to a conclusion. So some of these questions are, I mean, things like contingency. We've not even got to the stage of where we've got a planning application approved. So how we work out how much we fund it by and how we fund it is really something at a later stage, not yet.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Summers next.
Yeah, I've got a question for Mr. Cynic. Are we taking those or just, yeah, it's just a question about, you mentioned funding and a survey of people which found that only a minority wanted mixed use on the site. So I just want to know how the majority wanted to fund it, because, you know, simply knocking down the leisure centre or even refurbishing it as it is going to cost an enormous amount of money, and without some enabling development, I'm not quite sure how they expect it to be funded.
Well, it's in the council's public consultation. There was a presentation put together and it's on the website. If memory serves me right, one of the categories was increased council tax. Another one was council borrowing, and there was a third one which I can't remember, but those are the only options presented to the public.
Councillor Kelly next.
Thank you. So, like council members, I think we're running ahead of ourselves. There's going to be ample opportunity to ask questions, parking, the nature of the neighbourhood development, affordable, etc., etc., etc. So the substantive issue is about the demolition of the leisure centre. So my question to Councillor Munro, or maybe to one of the officers, and it goes to what Chris said, so I don't know your surname, is about the demolition of the place. How much does it cost to keep it there sort of boarded up, and how much does it cost to keep it knocked down? Is there a difference in costs?
Councillor Manro, can you answer that? Or is this one
I
for
think
officers?
I think one of the officers should take that because I don't have that number.
They're looking at their papers, I think. No pressure.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Wally. I'm Assistant Director for Capital Investment. I'm the author of the Cabinet Report. There's a section in the Cabinet Report at 5.2.2, which details the costs of, so just, I'm sure everyone is aware, Gurnell's currently closed and has been for approaching, I think it's 2 to 3 years now. So the council's having to allocate revenue funding just to keep the building safe and to prevent vandalism, etc. The paragraph I've referenced confirms that there's annual essential and maintenance and compliance costs of around £50,000 a year, and 24-hour security costs, which have been in place since October 2022, which are at a weekly cost of £6,500 a year. So to answer the council's question, it is costing the council ongoing unfunded revenue to be able to retain the existing building, which is part of the reason we've put forward the case for demolition.
Chair, it's Sherrod Cooper-Coles here. I'm supposed to be at a meeting now, but if there are any questions for me before I leave, I'm very happy to answer them on process or the sounding board.
Any questions from anybody? No, I think you're free to go. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Good luck.
Thank you. Councillor Kelly, I think, has a follow-up question.
Yeah, so Adam, that was sort of the first part of the answer, which is very useful. It's quite considerable amount of money, but what might it be? So that's the price if it stays up. What would the price be if you knock it down? How would that reduce?
Sorry, Councillor. So in terms of, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I mean, the idea is that the programme that we would work out, subject to, as has been said, this going through and moving forward to the design phase next, would be that we'd look to get a demolition contractor appointed. In an ideal world, subject to the planning process going well, it would be a relatively seamless process through to an incoming building contract. Sorry, Councillor.
Let me perhaps, so you knock it down, what's the cost then of keeping it knocked down till spades go in the ground? So there's the revenue costs now are considerable. If you knock it down, what would the revenue costs be? So I assume you wouldn't need as much security, you wouldn't need as much, but what might that cost be to the council?
Forgive me, Councillor. So I think our assumption is there would be no revenue costs. So as a demolished building, so it would be, I think the current working assumption, again, the detail would be developed, but that the building would be demolished, it would be hoarded off in anticipation of an incoming new build. And once the demolition works have been carried out and it had been hoarded off, it would be left with no expected revenue costs.
So it's sort of peppercorn issues around it. Yeah.
Correct.
So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kelly. Councillor Steed.
Just for the record, Chair, in response to Councillor Kelly's point, this isn't a question, but just the record. The officer's comments about the cost, and in response to Mr. Sinnott, it's £400,000 a year. That's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Any questions? Councillor Baclini.
Just a quick question. I'd like to ask Lib Dem councillors and the Conservative councillors if they have asked to be attending sounding board meetings.
Councillor Gallant, Councillor Hirsch.
No, I have not asked to attend the sounding board meeting. I'm working as a elected representative. No, and I consider that a conflict actually.
Same,
Same.
it's for residents to be there, I think.
Okay.
We've got other jobs.
What's the point of that question, Chair?
It's not for us to question. The question and also those who call in, it's completely in their right to ask a question. It's a good question. Nothing wrong with it. That's new stuff.
I'm sure this has been answered in the response and the document that none of us have seen, which is disappointing. And I just wanted to say, I welcome the spirit of the call in, if not the actuality, because I think some of these things could have been answered in a different forum. But I do appreciate that you want to make it as an effective piece of work as possible. I wanted to ask Councillor Munro the question that is here around monies that might be available from sports bodies. I'm assuming that we have pursued those and that they weren't forthcoming, which has led us to what I consider to be a very sort of fair and balanced proposal. But I'd love your thoughts on that, if possible. Thank you.
Councillor Munro.
Yes. So really, we may have access to some funding, but it would be at a later stage when those authorities could be sure that there was a planning application that had been approved and the kind of sort of what we were proposing, because each of the funding bodies, I think the officers can clarify a bit more, but each of the funding bodies have their own sort of rules around restrictions around what you can do with the money and how it should be used. So we may get some, but it's not going to be a large sum of money, and it may help us or it may hinder us, because sometimes they put on such restrictions that we may not be able to use it. So I think Adam Wally can actually answer that a bit more clearly, because he has had some, negotiations with some bodies. Or Chris, if he was there. Sorry, I don't know if Chris is there.
I'm happy to answer that, Chair, if you like.
Thank you. Yeah.
So hopefully, sorry, you can hear me. So there's probably 2 or 3 quick relevant points I'd say. Number one, we are, as a borough, actually, we have a fairly good track record of fundraising from sporting bodies and other bodies for projects. We've recently had the Gunnersbury Park Sports Hub that opened in the last few years that generated it was actually a £14 million project, and large chunks of that were funded from grant funding. So I suppose I say that by way of saying, I don't work for the Leisure Service, but my colleague Chris Bunting, who many of you will know, and his team are very successful, in fact, at fundraising and securing external grant funding. So we are saying that currently we don't believe there are any pots of money available for Gurnell to support Gurnell, and we say that having those discussions with funders. Clearly that situation is subject to change, and as the Cabinet report says, we will continue to reach out to those various funders that are out there to see if new pots of money are available. Very briefly, as Councillor Munro said, many funders also would expect a project to be further progressed than this project is at present to consider it eligible. So funders, for example, can expect a planning permission to be in place before they'll look at a scheme like Gurnell. So from our perspective, that's another reason for progressing is to make the scheme more eligible for funding. And lastly, as Councillor Munro has also just touched on, it is a case of assessing funding. It's very rare that funding comes without strings attached. And so although we're obviously always going to be keen to try and secure external grant funding, we also want to make sure that, we aren't compromising. We would need to look at those in the round and consider any, conditions that are attached to that funding, and whether, that suits our, the leisure centre that we want to provide for the residents of the borough. Hopefully that helps add to Councillor Munro's answer.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Kumar next.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to know, depending on how this goes forward, what is the time scale we're looking at, say, if demolition happens, because we wouldn't want, there's so much yet to happen. What would be the time frame for this? Maybe, I'm running ahead, but I think that's what's come up in quite a few conversations as well, and that's come to my mind too.
Thank you, Councillor Kumar. Councillor Manro?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The Cabinet report actually outlines a timeline, assuming you don't refer it back and there's not other delays. There is a timeline where we are looking at. I'm trying to remember the timeline. Sorry, I don't have the Cabinet report in front of me, only the iPad, but it indicates that the leisure centre would be built before the enabling development. And I think it's 24 to 25 would be, sorry, can I go to the officer?
Don't worry,
Sorry,
Councillor
Chair, I don't
Manro.
want to quote the wrong date.
It's all right, Councillor Manro. Mr. Wally's put his hand up to volunteer.
Thank you, Chair. The timeline is at paragraph 17.1 of the Cabinet report, if people want to refer to it. That assumes that if the Cabinet decision were to be put through, that we progress with design development with a view to submitting a planning application towards the end of this year, over the autumn and towards the end of this year. There is a target for a start on site for a new leisure centre next summer 2024, completion of that leisure centre autumn 2026, and any enabling residential housing would be projected to be completed in spring 2028. I would emphasise, as Councillor Manro has already said, this is a feasibility study, and clearly these dates are provisional, but you know, those are the dates we have at this time.
Thank you very much. Councillor Crawford.
Thanks. I think it's largely been answered, but my question was a follow-up to Councillor Newstubbs in respect of sports funding and funding from other bodies, which has been mentioned by some of the participants and the callers in this evening. My recollection, and the officers may be able to confirm a previous funding bids that we've made and been successful in this area, is that they are more likely to succeed when we have a defined plan on a defined site, which then can attract match funding. So, for instance, where we got match funding, for example, from the Acton facilities, or from North Ella Fields, or from various other previous proposals, was when a clearly defined proposal was before us. Because of the stage that we're at in this development, we haven't finished the options appraisal to identify that, and therefore further funding may open up in the future once the council has decided, or the council's officers have decided or indicated the Cabinet has endorsed a particular proposal. And that's when substantial might be the wrong word, forgive me, when some other funds may be available.
Mr. Wally, I think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, and I suppose to my earlier point really, which is that we would need a sort of a better developed brief for the scheme to be able to approach funders, and I think there is a pie chart somewhere in the Cabinet report that some may have seen, which sort of gives an indicative sense of funding. I think what we've said and what we, the report references, that we will obviously continue to look at all options for funding, but regrettably at this stage we're not seeing external funding as being a major sort of, is going to sort of really change or shift the dial on this to a great extent. We'll clearly try to get as much external funding and interest as we can, but I think, as Councillor Manro said earlier, we also don't believe the enabling development is likely to fund the full cost of the leisure centre. So, but to the councillor's question, that is correct.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Driscoll.
So from my understanding and observing the Cabinet meeting, am I right in thinking, this is for Councillor Manro, about this is essentially the next step in a feasibility study. So when we're moving further and looking at the enabling development and housing on the site, that will be the next stage, and that was explained at Cabinet. So I'm just curious why we've got that as part of a call in, if it was explained at Cabinet. So if that could be confirmed, that's coming in the next stage of the development of the project.
Councillor Manro.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think I can only apologise that the answer to the questions that were raised in the call-in are not with you, but I think they went with the supplementary sort of papers, but I will check, and I can only apologise, but it is a public document and it will be made available to everyone. All I would say is, look, the feasibility will determine how we manage what quantum of enabling residential development goes there. But as I've said before, very, very clearly, the heights are restricted and the numbers are restricted because we recognize the special nature of the MOL land and the openness. And therefore, because of that, as the officers pointed out, there is going to be a fairly large gap between what the enabling residential development will raise towards a leisure complex. The council will need to borrow money, and any sort of grants we get will only help us in terms of borrowing less. I don't think there's any circumstance in which we can say that we will not need to borrow money. We will need to borrow, and a substantial sum of money from the Public Loans Board to help this project take shape and move forward. So that's the reality of it. So all this talk about grants and whatever, enabling that to happen, I don't think they will. It will only help us not borrow as much. That's all it will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got Councillor Summers has got a second question.
Yeah, it's got a brief question, but seeing as both the Councillor Hirsch, Councillor Gallant mentioned it in their call in, just wanted to clarify in the MOL. I mean, obviously, that this is a matter for which will be discussed at length at the planning committee, and it's really a planning matter. But am I right in thinking, Councillor Manro, that the plan is to build largely on the current footprint of the building and the car park, which is quite a substantial car park, rather than, I think it was quite misleading that both Councillor Gallant and Councillor Hirsch described it as building on MOL land. It's largely going to be building on the site of what is currently there.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Summers, can you imagine if that land was fallow now and we were currently thinking about building a leisure complex on that site? Councillor Gallant and Councillor Hirsch would be saying, don't build anything. So at some time in the past, people have made the decision to build a leisure complex on metropolitan open land. And that time, the decision was made that it actually added social infrastructure to our community. So the reality is, yes, it will be built around that footprint, but as the feasibility reports show, there's different sort of options which we will test and go through the planning process with. But the intention is to use the car park and the building footprint currently to deliver the same quantum, but some residential enabling development and a state-of-the-art leisure centre.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. So I think that's the last of the questions. As we said, there is the actual specific questions which are part of the call-in. There is a report to that, so that will be circulated to everybody on the committee. We'll make sure it goes on the website as well, and obviously to yourselves, because most of what you're asking are fairly straightforward questions. So we'll go to the sum up now. So Councillor Hirsch and Councillor Gallant, you can sum up, and then Councillor Munro will follow up.
Thank you, Chair. The size of the project is considerable, and I think it includes building on metropolitan open land. That's at least in the plan. And building on metropolitan open land is in the study considered inappropriate at the moment. So has the size of the project been really considered in terms of, do we need the leisure centre to be that size exactly? Do we need the kind of housing to be exactly that size? The size of the development will, of course, kind of determine how risky it is to fund, how risky it is to be approved. And of course, once the old current leisure centre is demolished, that's it. So there is still a significant risk attached to the current thinking and the current plans. And size should be probably reconsidered, and size matters.
Councillor Gallant.
Thank you, Chair. So just to sum up my questions, the sounding board, I'm pleased we've had an input from a member of the sounding board and from Sir Sherrard as well, and I think that's a very healthy thing to have done. But I think the arguments put forward by the sounding board member have not yet been answered. So in that respect, I think that I do feel, and I continue to feel, that this matter should be referred back to Cabinet at this early stage. In terms of my question about parking, Councillor Munro says again that it's we're such an early stage. Why should we be thinking about such a minor detail? I'm afraid that transport and access cannot be considered a minor detail, and it should be considered at the earliest possible phase, and that's in terms of the housing and in terms of the sports centre. And on that respect as well, I feel that is worthy of more debate and should be referred back. So thank you very much for the answers. We've heard them. We'll look forward to reading the answers, the written answers, and we'll read them very carefully. But thank you very much for considering this, and I hope you'll consider referring it back to Cabinet for further deliberation.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Gallant. So Councillor Munro, you now can sum up, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's an interesting debate. I can only apologise again that the answers to the questions were not circulated or have been, but haven't got to you. All I would say really is I have answered the issue around parking. There's plans. If Councillor Gallant had taken some time to actually look at the reports that were published through the Cabinet, it would show that there's podium parking for 175 vehicles indicated in the plans. So I think it's not correct to say that I've said it. We haven't thought through it. We have. The only other thing I would say to members of the committee is the previous scheme, although the planning committee, which I was chair of, and Councillor Donnelly was a member, and another member of the Cabinet, Josh Blacker, was also on the planning committee. It was the planning committee that decided that it was an overdevelopment on MOL. The officers had recommended it for grant, and the GLA at stage 1 had supported that scheme. So therefore, some of this thing about the MOL issue, I think, is a red herring. This scheme has taken on board the views of the planning committee, not necessarily the officers or the GLA, around the size of that previous scheme. This new scheme, we've said very clearly, takes into account the views of the planning committee. Therefore, the heights are restricted, and the number of residential homes being put onto the site are also restricted. So therefore, I do believe that the special circumstances can be proved again on a much more reduced scheme. And therefore, I think the committee should uphold the Cabinet's decision and let us get on with it. Because the more delay we have, the longer it will take us to actually get to build a leisure centre that the people of Ealing deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. So before we proceed to the debate, we're going to ask Councillor Munro to leave the meeting, and also Councillor Donnelly, who has guest starred without saying. So thank you again, Councillor Donnelly. It's a second time this has happened.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
Okay, they've left the building or the room. Anyone like to say anything? Councillor Anson.
Thank you. Can I just clarify what it is that will be, what the question is that we kind of want to take back to Cabinet? I'm not entirely sure what the end result of our debate is going to be.
Well, as with all call-ins, it's whether we refer the reports back to Cabinet for consideration, particularly taking on the points Councillors Gallant and Hirsch have highlighted of concern, or whether we don't refer it back. So that's going to be a decision as in all call-ins. Report gets sent back. If the officers want to give any more detail on the decisions that were highlighted in that report, in the reports.
Yes, Chair. Happy to, if it would be helpful, happy to briefly summarise the recommendations. Forgive me, just bear with me and I'll just bring up the report. So, as we've said, it's sorry, I'm just scrolling up on what's a very long report to the top. So initially, so first of all, we were seeking cabinet agreement to progress to the next stage of the project in terms of design development. So appointing an architect team to take the scheme forward on what's called the optimised one leisure brief. There's details in the report of what that means. It's an option alongside several others that were developed, and based on a specific site plan, which is the one that's been discussed earlier. So essentially building within the footprint of the existing leisure centre and car park. So the second key conclusion, which has had some discussion today as well, is around demolishing the existing building. So the cabinet report and the feasibility study includes a reuse appraisal that goes into some detail on the merits of retaining the existing building versus demolishing it. And we've taken on board the feedback from that report and have hence recommended that demolition of the building be carried out, and therefore to agree to a tender process to appoint a building contractor, a demolition building contractor to do that work and to carry out any processes that are needed in terms of consents to do that. We've asked for a budget of £2.5 million to be allocated to carry out those activities. So that's to be drawn from an existing budget allocation of 12.5 million that was already allocated to Gurnell back in, I think it was 2016 when the previous scheme was in development. So there's always been a Gurnell line item in our capital programme. Cabinet was asked to agree that the scheme be developed up to planning permission. So that's as far as we're proposing to take the scheme at the next stage. And in parallel with undertaking that design work, to carry out a more detailed procurement analysis of the options for developing and delivering both the leisure centre and the residential component of the scheme. So at this stage, we aren't committing, or we haven't asked Cabinet to commit to a specific delivery route. The scheme will remain with a directly appointed team from the council, for the next stage. So we aren't appointing a developer or any other third parties at this stage. Hopefully that's helpful, Chair.
I think it's very helpful, and it's good to frame that in the context of what's actually on the table.
Sorry, I was just going to discuss about the demolition of the plans. And currently, obviously, the council are spending £400,000 a year, and presumably that's mostly to do with health and safety and making sure that the site is secure. And what I'm slightly concerned about is, whilst it's still, there's residents or antisocial behaviour might be on the site, hence the 400,000. So whilst I don't know, is there 24-hour security? Possibly, but that money could be used elsewhere. And whilst we have security, something could happen in that site whilst we're sort of delaying and having all these, for me, these call-ins that are not necessary, because essentially, some of these decisions can be done at planning. So we might put potentially people's, at risk, or even at the site in terms of community safety. But we're sort of making the area not safe potentially, because people might be trying to get into the building. So just something we need to kind of think about.
I'm just wondering, Chair, whether the missing report document that Councillor Munro has produced, do any of the officers have access to that report as we here and now?
So I haven't been sent it, but even if I did have access to it, we shouldn't be discussing it tonight because the public won't have seen it, and neither would councillors. So I think we should stick to what's been discussed tonight and the questions been asked tonight, because we can't, even if I sent it around by email now, that wouldn't be good enough for the public, and it's a public meeting. That's assuming I had access to it now, which I don't. So it's,
yeah, I mean, I see the point you're making. I just think it doesn't exactly tick the boxes of the council being open and transparent that the documents refer to, and somehow it's got lost in the ether, whatever. And some of the questions that have been asked presumably have been answered on that document to some extent. And, you know, it's not visible and no one can see it. I mean, would that document be made available subsequently to people and
So,
go on the
as I
council website?
So I said, it will be circulated to all members of the committee, everybody relevant here, but we'll make sure it goes on to as part of the minutes as the addendum on the agenda. So it's in the public domain. It's a public document.
Some ways it's a shame that Councillor Donnelly is not here because he'd probably know who the person is I'm referring to. I'm going to come to in a minute, but I think it's important to give context to Gurnell swimming baths and its history and its place in the borough. Prior to 1981, the place people swam was 10 meters away from here in the Longfield Baths, just there. That's where people swam, and that closed. Gurnell came, and shortly afterwards, Brentford Fountain Leisure Centre was the other big swimming pool in the local area. But it wasn't truly, in my view, even then, fit for purpose. It wasn't a great offer. It's always been a place that was very hard to maintain. Brutalist architecture of its time, not very aesthetic, and I recall this. So Scotland's greatest swimmer is David Wilkie, and I remember meeting David Wilkie at Gurnell swimming pool. I don't have a picture with him because I wasn't a good enough swimmer to have a picture with him, but my family friends do, and they still got it in their living rooms. In Hanwell.
Where are we going with this? Councillor?
Well, what I'm saying is, its nostalgia value is quite high. You know, and I understand that because I have it. I learned to swim there. My son started to learn to swim there, and we want other children and generations to swim there, and adults of all ages to swim there. It's the local swimming pool, but it was never a great facility. So this idea, in my view, that we could adequately retrofit that building is just not realistic. It's just not where the leisure market is. It's not where I just don't understand. And also the costs of keeping it boarded up, 400,000 as to knocking it down. This is a great opportunity. In essence, we're not going to build on more metropolitan open land. I'm not prejudging any application, but the footprint is there. There's a lot of talk about parking, where the language should be active travel measures. Councillor Gallard's size there, so he obviously doesn't believe in them. You know, the model is going away from people parking their cars when they go to the leisure centre, and any new leisure centre will accommodate as much parking as it can, and it will have state-of-the-art active travel measures, the buses, you name it. We can get it in there as part of the process. But I think the understanding here today is to move forward, and to move forward by knocking it down. I need to think we need to get the bulldozers in as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kelly. Councillor Brett.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to kind of refer back to Councillor Anderson and the slight confusion as to kind of really what we're doing here. I think that Councillors Hirsch and Councillors Gallant, whilst I don't want to be mean, most of these questions could have been answered by the officers without having to do the calling. In the report, there was something around reuse appraisal and the recommendation of demolition, and yet we've had tonight that we shouldn't demolish it before we have a plan. and before we refer it back to Cabinet. You're asking us to refer back to Cabinet basically a feasibility study, which is what the decision is supposed to be. And this is the call-in. So that's my understanding. And for me, those answers, if you'd actually read the report, some of those answers that you've put through tonight and you've questioned tonight are in there, and the answers are there. And the rest of the questions could have actually been answered in a timely manner without having to bring all of these people in tonight. So for me, I'm a bit aghast as to what this is actually supposed to be. Thank you.
Councillor Brett, very strong. Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to thank Mr. Sinnott from Save Gurnell for coming along, and obviously I appreciate your passion and concern, and I think that is shared by a lot of the councillors here as well. And I appreciate you presenting the idea that we shouldn't get rid of the site as it is until we know what's going to be there and tangible. I can understand there's a logic to that as well, but it's been mentioned several times this evening that £400,000 is the cost of not having Gurnell, and to have Gurnell would cost multiple millions of pounds to have Gurnell, and how going forward into the future, even if it was fully refurbished, the report is really clear about how it would be more environmentally expensive in carbon costs and it's just not feasible to extend the life of the structure. It's physically incredibly difficult and costly to do so. So while I appreciate the passion to keep and preserve it until you know absolutely what's going to replace it, I understand that completely, but there is an inevitability about it. It's not there isn't an ability to save it, but there is a commitment to actually replace it. And the commitment to replace it is not half-hearted. The timeline that is in the report and was questioned several times at the meeting, page 35, officers very helpfully came in at point 17, gives a commitment that the leisure centre will be coming in before any housing or any other sort of enabling development on the site. So that is a clear commitment, but it's a bit sad that that had to be raised to question when it's clearly in the report. So kind of like what Councillor Brett was saying, if it's in the report and there's a clear answer there, please read the report. So we've got a feasibility study, we've got some reassurances from a previously rejected planning application, had been a stage 1 approved by GLA, and we're going to be not as a large planning application by any means, substantially less, but we've got to see the details of that, and that details need to be worked upon, and we'll go to planning as well. So from what I can see here, I can't see grounds for referring this back. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Councillor Driscoll. I have Councillor Summers.
Thank you. Yeah, Councillor Brett said she was not going to be mean to the caller, and I think I am going to be a little bit meaner, I'm afraid. I think this calling is unfocused. It's confused. I get the impression that Councillor Hirsch and Councillor Gallant are a little bit embarrassed for being here and for calling this in. You know, their narrative doesn't even make sense. That on the one hand, they're questioning whether the pool should be this size, should it not be smaller? And then Mr. Gallant saying, well, what about building a data center next to it? You know, and then they're talking about, you know, not building on a MOL land. They don't even seem to know what they want. I think it sort of smacks of political grandstanding, and you know, it's not really, as Councillor Brett said, you know, all of this could have been discussed in. We could have got the answer in questions by email, and just on the point of parking, which again is a matter for planning. You know, planning will fully assess whether there's enough parking. But as Councillor Kelly says, you know, nowadays we don't build in that car park, that huge great car park. You know, that is just as ancient history, and this site is on the route of, I think it's the E10, the E9, the E7, the 95 bus. They all go past it. They all go to tube stations. So, I mean, if this does become, you know, it's huge destination swimming pool for the whole of the west of London, people can travel by bus and tube to get there. They don't all have to drive there. 175 spaces for those who have to drive, you know, for various reasons. This call in is not, frankly, worth it, and I think we should definitely not refer it to Cabinet.
Thank you very much, Councillor Summers. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Chair. This is just so difficult really to actually deal with this because we're dealing so much in hypotheticals, as we're saying. This is not a planning application, so I'm really struggling with this. I mean, for example, we talk about the metropolitan open land. Now, I wanted to come in with a follow-up question just now, was at the end of when we were asking questions about what the impact of maybe overlooking metropolitan open land or interfering with the view of metropolitan open land. But then I realised actually this isn't a planning committee. I don't actually have a planning officer here to answer those questions for me. So probably maybe the best thing is that if we can move on so I can actually ask those questions that I do actually want to ask of people who are going to be able to answer them for me. Thank you.
Councillor Newstab.
I may have missed my moment, but just to refer back to Councillor Kelly, and as much as I hate to disagree with colleagues, Gurnell was a spectacular pool, and I perhaps should have declared interest, but I'm pretty active member of Ealing Swimming Club and have swum up and down that pool thousands and thousands and thousands of times, mainly looking at the ceiling. When it rained, the water would come in, the ceiling was full of pigeon poo, and the water would taste revolting. It does need replacing. We desperately need this facility. And I would also like to add to Councillor Kelly's comments that I actually met Duncan Goodhue at Gurnell, and also have a picture of me at Gurnell. So it's a super important development. We need to get it done. I completely concur with everything that Councillor Anderson, Councillor Brett and Councillor Summers have said about this being a slightly spurious call-in. I understand that you feel the need, perhaps rightly so, to scrutinise really important developments. We do welcome that. We could have answered these all earlier, but as we are, let's get it to the next stage so that we can be swimming in the pool again.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Steed.
Thank you, Chair. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, I'm somewhat perplexed by some of the councillors' views that this should just be sort of pushed through without any consideration, or insufficient consideration, perhaps is more accurate. The questions that were placed on the cover sheet, I accept that some of the answers are to some extent answered in the report, but some of the questions are not particularly. And I think the fact that in theory we were meant to be provided with the answers, but sadly are not, is not a good precursor as to what may happen subsequently. We all know from being on planning committees and stuff that once this does get to planning, the amount, the momentum behind it by the council, by the leadership of the council, will make it increasingly difficult for any opposition to be successful. There are genuine concerns over many areas about the funding, as has been mentioned by Councillor Rice, and indeed as has been confirmed by Councillor Munro and officers. And I think on that basis, the decisions of the Cabinet are not safe, and I think it should be referred back.
I'm a little bit surprised what you've just said in terms of the planning. There's history only a couple of years ago that the planning committee turned down an unsuitable application. It's a curious statement to make. Councillor Crawford.
The chair's rather stolen my thunder in respect to the point that he's just made. What I would say is, I mean, I'm quite wary of making comments that or about something that we're not ready to talk about, a planning application. The place where the quasi-judicial place where councillors decide and communities have input into the decisions about what is built in our borough is on the planning committee. And you know, I like Councillor Steed, but for him to somehow imply that, you know, the leadership, because the leadership of the council likes a scheme, it will automatically go through. He may think that. He may think that. I would say to him, the reason it's, and he knows what I'm going to say now, but I'll say it again. The reason these schemes go through, Councillor Steed, in large part is because of the decisions and the framework set up by the government that your party and Councillor Gallant's party got together to form and set up a planning policy framework nationally that limits the ability for planning committees up and down this country to do what they always used to do and have more of a decisive role in determining planning applications. All of that, though, Chair, is completely out of the purview of this committee, and we shouldn't be discussing planning matters at this committee. As you have rightly reminded, Councillor Steed, only a couple of years ago, the Ealing Council Planning Committee refused to endorse the assessment of our own officers in respect of this very site. And I would like to say a few things briefly about the proposals that where we've got to with this, because I totally respect the position of local residents like Chris, who's here this evening, who may feel that the sounding board process has not delivered what he and his neighbours wanted or envisaged it as achieving, or doesn't feel that his views have been taken into account. Frankly, it is very difficult in these major projects to be able to be certain that everybody's view is adequately represented, because you are going to have to proceed with some sort of scheme that is inevitably not going to meet with the approval of every resident in every community. Now, I also respect the view of people who simply want the facility that's been closed for a while to be back and to be there and to be operational. And actually, that has been the big failing of, you know, the last period of time that I've spent in local government. I'm not going to revisit my history of learning to swim as somebody with cerebral palsy in this borough, but it was very difficult. And I used Gurnell, and I used the old Acton swimming baths, and I used many of them. Actually, using a swimming bath was important for me and my mobility, right? So I recognise the importance of a lot of what Councillor Hirsch, Councillor Gallant and colleagues and members of the public have and members of the committee have said about the importance of this facility. That's exactly why we need to get it right. But what I would say is what we're looking at here is options appraisals. And I would think that there will be another cabinet report to come, regardless of the decision we take tonight, that indicates a preference for a particular option. And then there's a planning process that actually gives more weight to the views of local residents. And it's a process through which councillors can fulfill a function. And in conclusion, Chair, because I know you want me to finish, there is a broader point about the success of this local authority in delivering sporting infrastructure and delivering projects. Very similar to this, in where we've had decaying facilities in my own locality, and we've pursued innovative proposals in a tight funding envelope in a period where we've lost nearly 400 swimming pools in the time since the coalition government took office and slashed all the funding for this. Right, we have delivered these, not just swimming pools, but other sporting facilities. I appreciate the frustration of people who don't feel like the process so far has been fair to them. And I would appeal to the council to make that work, because any facility that we put in is going to need the support of the local community. I don't think by saying that we want to proceed with this this evening, we're shutting the door on further scrutiny. I think further scrutiny and further work with local communities is really important. But on the basis of what we've been presented with this evening, I don't see a reason why we should slam the brakes on such an important project. Actually, we should get going and get further down the line so we can have a more informed, so local councillors can have a more informed discussion with their residents about the precise details of what we want to do, because then we can answer some of the questions about affordability, about how many, what type of enabling development it's going to be, what other things might fit in the facility. I recognise that that's a difficult conversation to have with the local community, but we need to do that, and we need to do that quickly. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Crawford. I think that's it. I haven't seen any hands up for further contributions, so we need to come to a decision, and we can either uphold the decision, a cabinet decision, or we send it back for reconsideration. We've had a good debate, some strong opinions. We have to really think, what's the purpose of this meeting? These are questions many of which should have been asked at the cabinet meeting or asking officers directly. So I'm going to recommend to the committee that we uphold the decision and make that as a formal recommendation, and we'll put that to the vote. All those in favour of upholding the decision, please show. Only one hand, councillor. All those against? Thank you very much. That's carried. So decision is to uphold the decision. Thank you very much. It's the end of the meeting. Thank you.